She handed me divorce papers on my birthday. I signed them, smiled, and made one phone call. She slid the envelope across the table just as the waiter placed the candle in front of me. It was one of those private rooms where everything is designed to look effortless. Low amber light. Thick velvet drapes. Crystal water glasses. A string quartet in the corner working too hard to sound invisible. My name embossed in gold on the menu cards. 40 guests arranged around a long walnut table as if this were not a birthday dinner, but a board meeting pretending to be affectionate. My wife, Helena Carrington Quinn, had planned every inch of it. The flowers were white orchids because she said red roses were too eager. The cake was dark chocolate because she thought vanilla looked cheap in photographs. Even the whiskey at my place setting had been switched from the small Kentucky distillery I actually liked to a $1,200 Japanese bottle her father preferred, because with Helena's family nothing was ever allowed to be personal if it could be made impressive instead. I was turning 40. I had spent the morning closing a municipal infrastructure deal in Newark, the afternoon on a plane to New York, and the last hour smiling through introductions to people I already knew. Hedge fund friends of her father's. Museum donors from her mother's board. Her brother Preston, who wore inherited confidence like a tailored jacket and had never once in his life paid the price of his own mistakes. A few people from Helena's wellness brand. 2 of her law school friends. Julian March, her media strategist, seated exactly 3 chairs to her left, close enough that they didn't have to raise their voices to hear each other. Julian was handsome in the careful way some men are handsome because they spend their lives studying reflection. Square jaw. Expensive watch. That neutral smile men use when they want to appear harmless while taking measurements. I had noticed his hand on the back of Helena's chair 3 separate times before dessert. I had noticed a lot more than that in the weeks leading up to that dinner. But we'll get there. First, the envelope. It was cream stock. My full name typed in narrow black letters. Adrian Michael Quinn. No handwriting. No softness. No attempt to disguise the purpose. It was the kind of envelope lawyers send when they want the paper to feel heavier than the words. Helena rested 2 fingers on top of it and smiled at me the way people smile right before they do something they have spent days rehearsing. "Happy birthday," she said. A few people laughed because they thought she was building toward a joke. I looked at the envelope, then at her. "That's a strange shape for concert tickets." That got a better laugh. Not from Helena. Her mother, Evelyn, lifted her champagne glass but didn't drink. Her father, Charles Carrington, kept his face still in that old money way that is really just theater for control. Preston leaned back in his chair with a satisfaction so obvious it almost embarrassed me for him. Julian looked at the table, not at me, which told me more than eye contact would have. Helena slid the envelope closer. "I'd rather do this cleanly," she said. "Without scenes. Without confusion. We both know this isn't working. I think it would be best if we handled it like adults." Like adults. That phrase landed in the room and stayed there. The violinist in the corner kept playing for another 2 measures before somebody from the restaurant staff, blessedly perceptive, signaled the quartet to stop. I opened the envelope. Petition for dissolution of marriage. New York. Prepared 2 days earlier by Halpern, Boss Klein. I knew the firm. Aggressive. Image conscious. The kind of attorneys who billed like surgeons and wrote like threat letters. There was a temporary property request attached. Spousal residence access. Preservation of lifestyle accommodations. Interim use of the Lake Street apartment. Ongoing disbursement from household accounts pending review. Not just divorce papers. A strategy. A public ambush wrapped in etiquette. Helena folded her hands in front of her. "I've already signed my part. I thought it would be more respectful not to drag this out privately for weeks." Respectful. I glanced down the table. Nobody looked surprised. Not really. Some looked uncomfortable. A couple looked fascinated. Most of them had the expression people wear when they think they are witnessing a powerful woman finally correcting an imbalance. The story had already been told in that room. I was just the last person expected to hear it. "You planned this?" I asked. "I planned clarity," Helena said. "At my birthday dinner. There wasn't ever going to be a perfect moment, Adrian. There are sentences that end a marriage. That wasn't one of them. That one just revealed it had already ended somewhere else." I read the first page twice. Not because I needed the words. Because I wanted to see whether my hands would shake. They didn't. That's the part people misunderstand when they talk about composure. They imagine it means you feel less. It doesn't. It means the feeling passes through a smaller opening. It cuts deeper because it has nowhere dramatic to go. I heard the air conditioner hum above the drapes. Heard silverware clink in the outer dining room. Heard Preston clear his throat to hide a smile. Heard Helena breathe in slowly through her nose the way she did whenever she thought she had positioned herself as the reasonable one. And beneath all of it I heard my father, a man who laid pipe in frozen ground for 32 winters, telling me something he used to say when equipment failed at the worst possible moment. "Don't argue with the brake. Shut the water off first." So I reached for the pen beside the dessert spoon. Helena blinked. "You're signing now?" she asked. "You wanted clarity. I expected we'd discuss it. You brought a legal filing to a birthday dinner with witnesses. That doesn't suggest discussion. It suggests staging." A little color moved into her cheeks. She hadn't expected resistance to sound this calm. I turned to the final page, wrote my name where her attorneys had marked the line, dated it, and slid the papers back across the table. Then I smiled. Not because any of it was funny. Because in that instant, with 40 pairs of eyes trying to decide whether I was broken, I understood something Helena had never fully grasped about me. I am at my most dangerous when I go quiet. I took out my phone. That was when the room changed. People always know more than they admit. They knew the dinner was theater. They knew the envelope had been meant to corner me. And the second I unlocked my screen, every person at that table felt the floor move by half an inch, because power is easy to enjoy until it starts checking its messages. I tapped one contact. Mara Kent. General Counsel. Chief Compliance Officer. The only person outside my family who had both full visibility into my companies and the discipline not to confuse access with intimacy. She answered on the first ring. "Happy birthday," she said. "Initiate the household separation protocol," I told her. "Effective now. Revoke spouse-level authorizations on Quinn Civic Holdings and all subsidiary accounts. Freeze the Carrington Harbor extension. Remove Helena from the Riverside Foundation vote scheduled tomorrow. And send the Westport packet to outside counsel." I paused and looked directly at my wife. "Tonight," I said. Mara was silent for maybe half a second. Not because she was confused. Because she understood exactly what a sentence like that meant at 9:14 p.m. on a Friday. "Understood," she said. "Do you want me to notify Blake as well?" "Yes. And tell him the signed petition was delivered publicly. There were witnesses." "Got it. Thank you." I ended the call. Nobody moved. Preston was the first to speak. What exactly was that supposed to accomplish? I set my phone beside the water glass. Damage control. Charles Carrington leaned back, his expression cooling into contempt. "If this is your attempt to make some kind of point, I suggest you don't do it here. This," I said, looking around the table, "is exactly where your daughter chose to do it." Helena's voice sharpened. "Adrian, don't be theatrical." I almost laughed at that. The woman who had served divorce papers between main course and dessert was asking me not to be theatrical. Evelyn finally spoke, soft as expensive cashmere and twice as suffocating. Perhaps everyone should take a breath. I've been taking breaths in this family for 11 years, I said. I'm good on oxygen. Julian looked up then, just once, and in his face I saw it. Not guilt. Calculation. He was trying to estimate what I knew, how much I knew, and whether he had underestimated the man sitting across from him. He had. The funny thing about humiliation is that the people arranging it always assume you arrived empty-handed. They assume the man being cornered has been too blindsided to prepare. What Helena didn't know was that I had spent the previous 19 days watching her move money, language, and allegiance in patterns that made no sense unless she believed an exit was already secured. What Charles didn't know was that the bridge loan keeping Preston's waterfront hotel project alive expired at midnight unless my office extended it. What Evelyn didn't know was that the charitable board seat she had promised one of her donors depended entirely on the Riverside Foundation vote Mara had just pulled Helena from. And what Julian definitely didn't know was that I had met with an outside forensic team 3 days earlier after my controller flagged unusual document access. Tied to a guest login Helena had no right to use. That was why I signed. Not because I was defeated. Because once someone brings the blade into the open, you stop pretending it's a letter opener. I folded my napkin and placed it on the table. Before anybody says anything else, I said, you should all understand something very clearly. I didn't just lose a wife tonight. Some of you are about to lose assumptions you have been living on for years. Helena's expression hardened. Is that a threat? No, I said. Threats are what people use when they still need permission to act. Then I stood up. And before I tell you what happened in the next 10 minutes, and why her father went from smug to pale before the coffee service even started, you need to understand who Helena Carrington was, what her family believed money could hide, and why they had spent a decade mistaking my patience for dependence. If you've ever watched people confuse restraint with weakness, stay with me. Because that night didn't start with divorce papers. It started years earlier, the first time Helena looked at my hands and decided she knew exactly how far a man like me was allowed to rise. I met Helena Carrington in a room where I did not belong, which is to say I met her in exactly the kind of room where I spent the first half of my life learning how not to flinch. It was a winter fundraiser at the New Bedford Maritime Museum 6 months after my 31st birthday. I had been invited because Quinn Civic Systems had just finished a coastal floodgate retrofit ahead of schedule and under budget, which made me useful enough to seat near donors, though not important enough to be introduced as anything more than one of the contractors on the resilience project. That was fine with me. I grew up in South Toledo with a father who fixed what broke and a mother who stretched every paycheck like cloth over a draft. My father, Michael Quinn, ran municipal pipe crews for the city until his knees gave out. My mother, Denise, spent 26 years at a public library where people mistook quietness for softness right up until they discovered she remembered every detail they had forgotten. We did not have inherited silver or summer houses or stories about our name on old stone buildings. We had receipts in coffee cans, work boots by the radiator, and a rule in our house that if you wanted something better you learned the structure underneath it. When I was 14 my father took me to a water main break at 5 in the morning because he said if I wanted to talk like I understood how cities worked, I ought to see one cracked open. Steam came off the street in white bursts. Men in reflective gear stood shin-deep in muddy trench water. People in nice houses up the block were calling the city hotline because they couldn't shower before work. My father pointed at the hole in the road and said, "Nobody rich ever thinks about the pipe until it fails. That's where the money is, Adrian. In what people only notice when it stops working." That sentence built my life. I studied civil engineering at Purdue on scholarships, worked nights doing quantity takeoffs for a drainage subcontractor, and spent my 20s crawling through utility corridors, flood channels, and municipal budget hearings that smelled like wet paper and stale coffee. By 28 I had learned two things very clearly. First, cities were desperate for people who could explain infrastructure to financiers and explain financing to engineers. Second, most men making the real money in the sector had never held a torque wrench and didn't know the first thing about field crews. So I built a company in the Gap. Quinn Civic Systems started with 3 folding tables in a warehouse office outside Newark, 1 white pickup, 2 exhausted project managers, and contracts nobody prestigious wanted because the margins looked too small and the risk looked too ugly. Stormwater rehabilitation. Emergency pumping station upgrades. Tunnel inspections. Public-private bridge maintenance packages. Not glamorous. Not the kind of work people brag about over oysters. Exactly the kind of work that compounds. By the time I met Helena, we were running projects in 4 states and consulting on resilience planning for 2 port authorities. I wasn't a billionaire. I wasn't on magazine covers. But I was liquid, growing, and impossible to dismiss by anyone who had read a balance sheet without having someone else explain it to them. Helena was standing near a ship model in a black dress so simple it probably cost more than my first truck. She had one hand wrapped around a champagne flute and the kind of posture people acquire when they are raised to assume rooms will make space for them. Chestnut hair pinned up. Diamond studs no bigger than raindrops. That calm, selective smile women from certain families learn young, the smile that says I can be charming without ever becoming available. She asked me a question nobody else had asked all night. She asked whether I actually liked the work. Not whether it was lucrative. Not whether government contracts were a headache. Not whether I planned to sell. She said, "Do you like building things people never see?" And I did the stupid, immediate thing a man does when he has spent a decade being treated like a useful appliance and suddenly someone looks at him as if he contains interior weather. I told her the truth. I told her I loved it. I told her there was something satisfying about keeping a city dry in a storm and knowing most of the people sleeping through the night would never realize how close the water had been. I told her beautiful things were easy to notice. Function took intelligence. She smiled then, really smiled. "That's a very dangerous sentence in a room full of donors," she said. "Why?" "Because most of them have built entire identities around being noticed." I should have heard it, even then. The elegance of the line. The way it positioned her slightly outside the vanity of her own world while still living entirely inside it. Helena's greatest talent was never deception in the cheap sense. She rarely lied outright. She curated distance. She arranged angles. She made you believe she was standing beside you while quietly remaining on the balcony above the entire scene. Still, I fell hard. We spent 3 months moving between Boston, New York, and whatever city my work had dragged me into that week. She had a graduate degree in cultural policy and an eye for spaces most people only notice after someone with taste has finished touching them. She spoke in complete thoughts. She had read more fiction than anyone I knew. She said my hands looked like they belonged to a man who could build a house from memory. She made me feel not civilized exactly, but translated. The Carringtons entered the frame later. Charles Carrington had built his career taking an inherited regional banking name and parlaying it into private wealth management, donor networks, and the kind of advisory influence that never appears on paper in the proportion it rules a room. He was not flamboyant. Men like Charles never are. They prefer understatement because it allows them to perform superiority as good breeding. Evelyn Carrington sat on museum boards, hospital boards, educational boards, and one particularly self-congratulatory committee devoted to preserving the architectural heritage of homes nobody under the age of 50 could afford to purchase. Helena's younger brother Preston had tried 3 ventures by the time I met him and failed upward through all of them. Their world was full of surnames used as shorthand for virtue. Mine was full of invoices. Charles liked me less the moment he realized I wasn't dazzled. Oh, he was polite. The Carringtons weaponized politeness the way some families weaponize volume. But the first time he visited one of my project sites in Hoboken, he stepped over a spool of cable and said, "Remarkable that you've managed to create so much value in sectors most people prefer not to think about." Most people. Not all people. Just the kind whose preferences he considered important. I said, "That's usually where the opportunity is." He smiled like a banker approving a loan for a man he expected to fail with dignity. There were 1,000 moments like that. Evelyn asking at dinner whether my mother felt comfortable attending the wedding in Boston, since formal events can be so tiring if they aren't part of one's usual rhythm. Preston introducing me to a friend as the guy who makes storm drains sound profitable. Helena laughing once, only once, when Charles joked that I had elevated pipe work into an aesthetic philosophy. She apologized for that one later. Kissed my cheek. Said I was too sensitive to tone when I was tired. That's how erosion works. Not with a landslide. With weather. The marriage itself looked beautiful from the outside. It usually does when money and discipline work together long enough to curate the photographs. We bought a townhouse in Brooklyn Heights and renovated it with the kind of restraint interior magazines describe as timeless. Helena launched a foundation-backed arts education initiative that I funded quietly through a donor-advised structure because she said direct transfers would make her feel like a dependent. I respected that. Or thought I did. I paid off her graduate loans without announcement. I absorbed the renovation overruns her architect somehow created in every room. I extended a credit facility to Preston's second hospitality project after Charles framed it as a temporary bridge for a family member with excellent instincts and poor timing. I kept telling myself these were not concessions. That this was what marriage looked like when two lives merged at different speeds. Then Helena decided she wanted to study law. Not because she needed the credential for money. She said she wanted authority that didn't come from her last name or my financing. I admired that. Maybe more than I should have. I paid tuition, housing, books, exam prep, and the invisible costs nobody counts when they tell stories about ambition. The dinners missed. The travel shifted. The household weight redistributed. I covered all of it because I believed in the person I thought she was becoming. 3 years later she carried herself differently. Law school didn't sharpen Helena into someone new. It simply gave structure to qualities that had always been waiting for better tools. Her language grew cleaner. More strategic. She became fascinated by leverage, optics, exposure, privilege in the legal sense, not the moral one. She stopped saying things like that feels unkind and started saying things like that creates unnecessary vulnerability. We fought less, but the silence between fights changed temperature. Sometimes I would come home from a week in Norfolk or Camden and find her sitting in the library with one lamp on and a legal pad open, not reading, not working, just thinking in narrow lines. When I'd ask what was wrong she'd say nothing was wrong. Then she'd ask odd questions. How were company voting rights structured if something happened to me? Would Riverside still stay in my personal control if Quinn Civic took outside capital? Why had I never moved the brownstone into a joint LLC if we were married and had nothing to hide? At first I answered because I thought curiosity meant trust. Later I answered less. Not because I suspected her. Because something in her interest felt less like partnership and more like due diligence. The first time I saw Julian March was at a media dinner for Helena's Legal Aid Initiative. He was younger than her by 3 years, articulate in that polished consultancy dialect that makes even banal observations sound invoiceable, and very good at making women with money feel newly legible to themselves. He was brought in to help rebrand the initiative. Story, donor positioning, public voice, all of it. By the end of that night he knew exactly how to stand near Helena without appearing to take up space. That kind of man is never accidental. He started showing up often after that. Strategy sessions. Press photography. Branding meetings that ran late. I noticed his name in calendar invites more than once. Helena said I was being provincial the first time I asked whether he needed to text her after midnight to discuss color palettes and sponsor talking points. Provincial. A useful word if you want to shame a man for recognizing intimacy when it walks into his kitchen wearing cologne. But even then I didn't think divorce. I thought distance. I thought pride. I thought two ambitious adults moving through a rough season badly. That is the mercy of love when it still has hope in it. It interprets late. And while I was still interpreting, Helena and her family were already converting our marriage into a negotiation they believed I would enter from the weaker side. The first real crack didn't come from perfume on a collar or a stray message lighting up the wrong screen. It came from my controller, a woman named Elise Navarro who had spent 9 years saving me from expensive surprises and one brief, catastrophic software migration that I still blame on a consultant with unusually white teeth. Elise called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in Richmond reviewing a storm resilience bid for 3 counties that had finally learned climate maps were not political opinions. "I need 10 minutes, she said. Not hello. Not are you free. Just I need 10 minutes. That's the voice finance people use when their professionalism is the only thing standing between a bad discovery and an ulcer. I stepped out of the meeting, crossed the hotel lobby, and sat in an empty conference alcove facing a fake ficus and a print of a sailboat no one had ever loved. What happened? Guest access credentials were used to pull documents from the Riverside Philanthropic Trust folder and the Harbor Extension file, Elise said. Twice last week. Once yesterday. Who had the credentials? That's the part one need you to listen to carefully. The credentials were issued to Helena's temporary assistant 6 months ago for gala seating documents and donor reimbursements. They were supposed to expire in 48 hours. They didn't. Someone reactivated them. Can you trace the device? Partially. Home network once. Midtown co-working space twice. IP masked the 3rd time. I stared at the sailboat print and felt that cold, measured part of my mind wake up fully. Riverside was not a vanity project. It was a foundation vehicle I had created after my father died, aimed at funding utility apprenticeships, trade scholarships, and public works training in cities that had stopped treating skilled labor like a future. Helena sat on the board because she had insisted she wanted to help shape the public side of it. The Harbor Extension was even more sensitive. It was the revolving bridge line propping up Preston's latest venture, a luxury waterfront hotel in Connecticut he had somehow managed to mismanage before the roofline was finished. Neither file was casual reading. Who else knows? I asked. Only me and the forensic consultant I used to confirm the access pattern. I didn't escalate because I didn't know if this was domestic, legal, or stupid. It isn't stupid, I said. Elise was quiet. Do you want me to shut everything down? No. Preserve logs. Mirror the folder. Bring in outside forensic review under privilege. Use Mara. And Elise? Yes. Don't send anything to my personal email. Understood. When the call ended I sat there for another minute and ran back through the previous month like a man checking structural supports after the first visible crack. Helena asking odd questions. Preston suddenly assuming the Harbor Extension would roll another 90 days. Julian appearing in our orbit more than his retainer justified. Charles inviting me, with unusual warmth, to his club for a drink the week before my birthday and spending most of that drink discussing the elegance of efficient separations in modern life. At the time I had thought the conversation merely tasteless. Now it rearranged itself. I did not confront Helena. I know some people hear that and call it cold. I don't. I call it adult. Confrontation without information is just noise. It satisfies the injured ego while endangering the injured future. My father never ripped open drywall because he suspected a leak. He followed the waterline first. So I followed it. Mara Kent met me that Thursday in a conference room on the 38th floor of our Manhattan office with a yellow legal pad, 2 sealed folders, and the expression of a woman mentally preparing to replace emotion with sequence. Mara had clerked on the Second Circuit, turned down a white shoe partnership, and spent the last 6 years making sure my companies were built like structures meant to survive both storms and ambition. She had no patience for performative morality and even less for family theatrics. Which was why I trusted her. She laid out the problem in 4 clean parts. First, Helena's board access at Riverside had exposed her to trust governance materials she did not need for day-to-day philanthropy. Second, the harbor extension to Preston's hotel was due for renewal at midnight on my birthday unless I personally approved the rollover. Charles knew that. Preston knew that. Helena might or might not have known it, but based on recent file access Mara was unwilling to assume innocence. Third, the brownstone, the Lake Street apartment, and most of the visible luxuries of our life were not held the way outsiders assumed. Some were mine premaritally. Some were in Quinn Civic Holdings. Some sat in a family trust structure Helena had always mocked as overly cautious until now. Fourth, our post-nuptial amendments from 3 years earlier, signed when Helena entered law school and wanted total clarity around debt, sponsorship, and public reputation, contained morality and disclosure language far stronger than she remembered. Or stronger than she'd read carefully. One clause in particular governed hidden material relationships that could expose either spouse to financial or reputational risk through misuse of shared information. If she's involved with someone connected to donor communications, company filings, or family financing, Mara said, the papers she delivered tonight might not be the clean leverage move she thinks they are. You said tonight. Mara looked up. I think she serves you on your birthday. Publicly if possible. The legal prep date lines up. The witness value is obvious. And if her family believes you're emotionally attached enough to negotiate from shock, they'll see theater as strategy. I leaned back in my chair. How sure are you? Sure enough to prepare. Not sure enough to accuse. That difference matters. People who ruin themselves in high-conflict divorces usually do it in the gap between suspicion and proof. They start firing words like bullets before they've checked whether the gun is loaded with blanks. Mara didn't work like that. Neither did I. So we prepared quietly. A household separation protocol already existed because Mara insisted all senior principals have one. Most executives think estate planning is about death and divorce planning is about pessimism. Both are wrong. It is about preserving function when emotion gets loud. Ours covered digital authorizations, account permissions, property access, transportation services, foundation roles, pending extensions, and immediate counsel notifications if a separation became active. Once you trigger it, Mara said, it will be noticed. Good, I said. She slid the second folder toward me. Inside was a discreet report from the forensic team. Document access logs. Calendar overlaps. Metadata pulls from donor decks. A handful of encrypted message patterns between Helena and Julian that the consultants could not read but could timestamp. Enough smoke to justify preparing for fire. Not enough to start screaming in the hallway. That weekend Helena became almost sweet. That was the part that got me. Cruelty is easier to respond to. Softness delivered late, when you've begun to suspect bad faith, has a very specific kind of violence in it. She asked whether I'd like the old jazz trio for my birthday dinner instead of a DJ. She sent me a photo of a cufflink set I'd once admired and asked which initials I preferred engraved. She kissed me on the shoulder while I was reading in bed and said she knew the last year had been hard on us. I looked at her profile in the lamplight and thought one of two things was true. Either she felt guilty. Or she was rehearsing innocence. On Monday Charles called to say he was thrilled Helena had taken such personal ownership of the birthday arrangements. On Tuesday Preston sent me revised numbers on Harbor that were so optimistic they crossed into fantasy. On Wednesday Julian forwarded me a press mock-up for Riverside's Autumn Apprenticeship Gala that included Helena's name in primary donor chair placement and mine in smaller print beneath the foundation mark. I stared at the layout for a long time, not because the hierarchy offended me, but because it confirmed what I had started to see. They all believed visibility was the same as control. Whoever appeared centered in the photo must be driving the room. It is one of the oldest mistakes made by people who inherit stagecraft. By Thursday Elise had confirmed there had been a draft transfer request associated with Harbor, one that would have required a chain of approvals ending with my office. It hadn't been executed. It had, however, been prepared. If the extension rolled, Preston would survive another quarter. If it didn't, his lenders would begin pulling threads by Monday. Do you think Helena knows that? Elise asked. I think someone told her enough to feel confident, I said. That Friday morning, the day of my birthday, I woke before dawn and went running over the Brooklyn Bridge the way I used to when decisions felt too large for furniture. New York was blue and silver and not yet fully awake. Delivery trucks coughed at loading docks. River wind cut through my sweatshirt. By the time I turned back toward home, I had made peace with 3 facts. 1. My marriage was already on paper somewhere other than my own heart. 2. Whatever happened that night, I would not react in a way that made me easier to narrate against. 3. If Helena had confused my love for a system she could enter, map, and exit with assets attached, then the kindest thing I could do for both of us was let reality correct her quickly. I spent the afternoon in Newark because the city didn't care that it was my birthday and because sometimes the best way to avoid dread is to stand in a place governed by rebar, water pressure, and schedules. Field crews wished me happy birthday over burnt coffee. A superintendent gave me a hard hat sticker that said old man, still upright. It was the most sincere thing I'd receive all day. At 5:30 I flew back to Teterboro, changed in the car, and reviewed one last email from Mara. No new action recommended. Prepare for service. Witnesses likely. Trigger only if served. Simple. Almost elegant. When I arrived at St. Clair House, the host greeted me with rehearsed delight and called it Mrs. Quinn's special surprise evening. Helena met me in the lobby wearing ivory silk and earrings I had bought her in Florence on our 5th anniversary. She kissed me lightly, too lightly, and said everyone was already seated. Everyone. That word told me what kind of night it would be. Not intimate. Not restorative. Not even private in the real sense. Curated. As we walked toward the dining room, she slipped her hand through my arm and said, "Let's make tonight easy." I looked down at her hand on my sleeve. Easy for who? I asked. She smiled without answering. Then she opened the door, and I saw the whole table rise for me, glasses lifted, faces bright with a warmth that already felt rented. And right then, before the speeches, before the steak knives and candlelight and envelope, I knew one thing with perfect certainty. Whatever Helena had planned for my birthday, she believed I would still be the last man in the room to see it coming. That miscalculation was the most expensive gift she ever gave me. The first 40 minutes of the dinner were almost impressive in their discipline. If you had walked in halfway through, you might have mistaken the tension for refinement. People confuse those two all the time. There were oysters followed by halibut for the people who liked restraint and ribeye for the men who wanted to look decisive while ordering. Helena had arranged place cards with enough care to shape every conversation. Charles at one end. Me at the other, which should have been a clue. Evelyn beside the museum donor she was courting. Preston across from a lender whose face I recognized from 2 prior restructurings. Julian positioned exactly where Helena could include him without having to justify him. I watched the table the way I watched negotiation rooms right before somebody pretends a conclusion arrived naturally. Patterns tell on people. Every time I spoke, Helena listened with her head tilted and her smile fixed, as if she were already gathering future evidence of my tone. Every time Charles told one of his stories about markets, legacy, or discipline, he glanced toward me half a beat too late, checking whether I had absorbed the intended lesson. Preston drank faster than normal, which told me he was nervous. Julian barely drank at all. We made it through the first course on reputation alone. Then the toast started. Evelyn stood first. She spoke beautifully, because women like Evelyn spend half their lives preparing for rooms to go quiet for them. She called me driven, impressive, and unexpectedly adaptable to a family like theirs. Unexpectedly adaptable. That one landed exactly where she meant it to. People laughed. Even Helena. I lifted my glass. High praise, I said. Evelyn smiled. It was meant that way. Charles stood next. He talked about standards. About commitment. About how real success was not merely the ability to build wealth, but the ability to sustain environments where other people could flourish. He thanked Helena for her grace, her intelligence, and her gift for elevating the quality of every room she entered. Then he said, and of course, Adrian, happy birthday. May the next chapter of your life bring the same correction and maturity you've brought to your work. Correction. There it was again. Language that made more sense if you knew what was coming. By then I wasn't angry. Anger is hot. This was colder than that. This was the feeling a man gets when he finally sees the shape of the trap and realizes the people building it mistook him for someone who panics in small spaces. Helena rose last. The room shifted toward her automatically. She was very good at holding silence until it became a kind of architecture. Thank you all for being here, she said. Birthdays are usually about celebrating what has been. But I think sometimes they should also be about honesty. About having the courage to acknowledge when a season has ended and another needs to begin. A few faces tightened. Not because they were shocked. Because they were bracing for impact on my behalf. Helena looked at me. Not with tenderness. Not even with visible cruelty. With the serene determination of someone who had rehearsed virtue so long she could no longer distinguish it from entitlement. Adrian, she said, you've given me many things. Stability. Opportunities. Encouragement in moments when I wasn't sure of myself. For that I will always be grateful. But gratitude is not the same as love, and staying out of duty helps no one. I think we owe each other the dignity of saying aloud what has been true for a while. The room was silent enough to hear ice settle in a glass. Helena picked up the envelope from beside her plate. I've had papers prepared, she said. I hope you'll see this not as a cruelty, but as an act of clarity. Then she slid them to me. Which brings us back to the moment the waiter set down the candle and my marriage, such as it still was, became dinner theater. I already told you I signed. But what I haven't told you is how the room looked in the 6 seconds after I did. Surprise is unattractive on people who think they are directing events. Helena's face didn't fall apart. She was too trained for that. But it flickered. Just once. The tiniest failure in her timing. She had expected resistance. Questions. Hurt. Possibly bargaining if she was lucky. Instead she got a signature delivered with the same calm I used to authorize tunnel boring equipment and 7-figure bid revisions. That calm unsettled everyone more than shouting would have. Then I made the call. When I said, freeze the Carrington Harbor extension, Preston's hand stopped halfway to his wineglass. When I said, remove Helena from tomorrow's Riverside vote, Evelyn turned fully toward me for the first time all evening. And when I said, the signed petition was delivered publicly. There were witnesses. Charles lost the expression of a man indulging unfortunate emotion and became what he actually was beneath the polish, a banker hearing the first click in a vault door. After I hung up, nobody rushed to fill the silence. Helena did first. What are you doing? She asked. Responding to service. By trying to embarrass me? No, I said. By declining to subsidize the performance. Charles set his napkin down carefully. Let's not turn this into something vulgar. A public ambush on my birthday with your daughter's attorneys on standby was already vulgar, I said. I'm just refusing to mislabel it as sophistication. Preston laughed once, short and ugly. Jesus, Adrian. Don't flatter yourself. Harbor has nothing to do with this. I looked at him. Then you won't mind losing the extension. That shut him up. Helena's voice went low. You don't get to retaliate because I finally chose honesty. Honesty would have been a private conversation. I tapped the documents. This is leverage packaged as liberation. Julian spoke then, which was a mistake. Maybe everybody should slow down, he said. This clearly isn't the place for business consequences. I turned toward him. You're right. Which makes your presence especially interesting. His jaw shifted. Just once. Helena straightened in her chair. Leave him out of this. I haven't put him into anything yet. Those last two words changed the room again. Evelyn clasped her hands. Adrian, if there have been misunderstandings. There haven't been misunderstandings, I said. There have been assumptions. Different problem. Charles leaned forward, all softness gone now. Whatever grievance you think you have, you are not going to use my daughter's personal decision as an excuse to destabilize unrelated commitments. Unrelated? I asked. You mean the loan extension your son has been counting on? The foundation vote Helena has been using to court your donors? The access to internal files someone from my own household had no business reviewing? Those unrelated commitments? Helena's eyes cut to mine. There it was. The first real sign of panic. Not because I was loud. Because I was specific. Adrian, she said carefully, be very careful. That's the first useful advice I've heard tonight. Preston pushed his chair back a few inches. You're making accusations with no proof. No, I said. I'm stating facts while deciding how many more of them need to leave this room. He looked at Charles. Charles looked at Helena. Helena did not look at Julian. Which told me everything I needed. People talk about betrayal like it's a knife in the back. Most of the time it isn't. Most of the time it's a synchronized glance between people who thought they'd have longer before the lights came on. The waiter appeared at the door carrying coffee service and took one look at the table before retreating with a level of instinct I genuinely admired. Helena lowered her voice. This is exactly why I didn't want to do this privately. You turn everything into control. I almost answered quickly. Almost. But quick answers are gifts. They let the other person believe they set the pace. So I drank some water instead. Then I said, you didn't do this privately because privately you'd have to explain why your media consultant knows the same donor sequencing you do. Why guest credentials linked to our home network accessed files involving Riverside and Harbor. Why your father's timing suddenly improved the week before my signature was needed on your brother's extension. Julian's face lost color. Not much. Enough. Helena stared at me in a way that made me understand she had never once truly imagined I might prepare before being cornered. That, more than the papers, more than the affair itself, was the insult underneath all of it. She loved me enough to use me. She did not respect me enough to assume competence under pressure. You had me watched. She said. I had my company protected. Through forensic review. Through legal privilege. Over what? Some emails. Some scheduling overlap. Interesting line of defense, I said. I hadn't mentioned email yet. Charles stood up. We're done here. You were done the moment you let her turn this dinner into a witness table, I said. He pointed a finger at me then, the first openly crude gesture I'd ever seen from him. You don't get to speak to my family like this after everything we accepted to make this marriage work. Accepted. There are words that reveal the entire basement of a person's character. Accepted was one of them. I stood too. Let's tell the truth for once, I said. You never accepted me. You tolerated my usefulness. You liked the townhouse, the donor checks, the fact that I cleaned up Preston's disasters without humiliating him publicly, and the way my funding made Helena feel independent while staying comfortably expensive. But you never accepted me. Because men like you don't know how to respect what wasn't inherited unless it stays grateful. Evelyn whispered, Charles. But he had already crossed the line from refined to real. My daughter diminished herself for years trying to translate you into rooms you still don't understand, he snapped. I laughed then. I really did. Not loudly. Just enough. Your daughter didn't translate me, I said. She mistook presentation for power. Common family habit, apparently. Preston muttered something under his breath that sounded like arrogant bastard. No, I said, turning to him. Just solvent. Different thing. He shoved his chair back and stood. You think money makes you untouchable? No. I think contracts matter. That was when Helena finally lost her composure. Not all at once. Helena didn't break. She sharpened. Fine, she said. You want the truth. I am done living inside systems you built and then calling it protection. I am done being treated like a sponsored project in your life. I am done pretending gratitude is romance. And yes, I served you tonight because I knew if I did it at home you'd make it procedural and bloodless and somehow I'd still end up looking unreasonable for wanting out. For the first time all night her voice carried actual heat. And inside that heat was something else. Not innocence. Resentment that I had denied her the scene she'd budgeted for. You wanted bloodless? She said. Congratulations. You've been bloodless for years. That one landed. Because it contained enough truth to sting even while being used dishonestly. Love had gone cold in our house long before that dinner. I knew it. She knew it. What she omitted was that she'd chosen spectacle not because I was incapable of feeling, but because I was increasingly difficult to manipulate once feeling stopped making me careless. Maybe you're right, I said. Maybe I have been procedural. Comes from learning the hard way that messy damage spreads. I picked up the signed papers and held them out to her. You want out? Take it. You're out. She didn't reach for them. That was the second flicker. Because this, too, had been miscalculated. Freedom sounds noble until it arrives stripped of the financing, narrative control, and strategic timing you plan to carry out with it. So I placed the papers on the table in front of her instead. Then I looked at Julian. One piece of advice, I said. If you're going to build a future with a woman who uses witness seating charts for emotional warfare, don't let her convince you she'll spare you because she calls it honesty when she does it. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Helena stood. Don't you dare. Then tell him he's not the first man you've spoken to through legal language when intimacy got inconvenient. Evelyn went rigid. Preston swore. Charles looked ready to either hit me or offer me an acquisition term sheet, the two emotional registers men like him know best. And still I wasn't finished. I took my phone out again, opened my calendar, and looked at Helena. Since we're committed to public clarity, here's one more. Harbor doesn't roll at midnight. Riverside votes without you tomorrow. Household staff access changes in 1 hour. Drivers and cards are deauthorized by morning. Your apartment preference request in these papers has no effect on title structures you apparently never bothered to understand. And if outside review confirms misuse of internal documents, this gets much more expensive for the wrong people. Preston's face went from red to gray. You can't do that over a divorce. No, I said. I can do that over governance. The divorce is just what revealed the timeline. Then, because I wanted the sentence to land exactly where it belonged, I turned to Helena and said it quietly. The cruelest thing you've done tonight isn't handing me papers. It's showing me you really believed I built an entire life without learning how to protect it. She stared at me. No answer. No clever correction. Just the dawning recognition that the envelope had not cut where she intended. I buttoned my jacket. Happy birthday to me, I said. And I walked out of the private dining room while the candle still burned on the untouched cake. The strange thing about walking out of your own public humiliation is how normal the hallway looks. Outside the private room, St. Clair House was still serving anniversaries, first dates, client dinners, and whatever else wealthy people use dim lighting to soften. A hostess smiled at me because from a distance I probably looked like a man heading to take an important call, not a man who had just signed away a marriage between courses. I took the elevator down alone. In the mirrored brass of the cab I looked exactly like myself. Dark suit. White shirt. Tie still straight. 40 years old. No visible blood. That's another lie people tell about betrayal. They expect wreckage to announce itself cosmetically. Most of the time the body keeps the secret for a while. By the time I reached the sidewalk, Mara had texted. Protocol active. Blake notified. Harbor freeze confirmed. Access revocations in process. Need location. I typed back, walking. 10 minutes. I went north without deciding to. Cold air helps when your thoughts start trying to outrun sequence. Midtown was all reflected traffic and expensive windows. My phone buzzed twice in under a minute. Helena. Then Charles. I ignored both. The third call was from Blake Mercer, my divorce attorney. Blake had the patient voice of a man who billed by the hour but thought by the chess clock. We had known each other since college. He was the only litigator I trusted because he enjoyed winning less than he enjoyed being structurally correct. Tell me everything in order, he said. So I did. The dinner. The witnesses. The staged service. The prior file access. Julian's presence. The lines about clarity and adulthood. My signature. The call to Mara. When I finished, Blake exhaled once. Public service at a birthday dinner is grotesque, he said. Useful, but grotesque. Useful how? It helps us on narrative if she later claims coercion or emotional volatility. The witness count cuts both ways. Also, if she delivered while undisclosed access and possible related party coordination were in play, timing becomes relevant. Do not call her. Do not go home alone without counsel copied. And Adrian? Yeah. If she's panicking, she may try one last private conversation to reposition what tonight meant. Do not let emotion edit your memory. That is one of the most valuable services a good lawyer provides. Not aggression. Memory preservation. I ended up in Bryant Park, sitting at one of the empty green metal tables because I needed the city to stay public around me. A man at the next table was eating noodles from a carton and watching a hockey highlight on his phone. Two teenagers were laughing over something invisible in one shared screen. Skate rentals had shut down for the night, but strings of winter lights still hung over the rink like the idea of festivity someone had forgotten to take home. My marriage had ended 30 minutes earlier and the world, rude as always, had continued without consultation. That's when Helena called again. This time I answered. Where are you? She asked. No hello. No are you okay? Just location. Out. We need to talk privately. You had your chance at private. I did what I had to do. No. You did what you preferred to do with witnesses. Different thing. She went silent for a second. I could hear traffic behind her. Male voices too. One of them Preston's. You embarrassed my family, she said. I looked up at the lights over the rink and actually smiled. Helena, you served me divorce papers over birthday dessert. Let's not get careless with the word embarrassed. Her voice dropped. Preston says Harbor was frozen. That's because Harbor was frozen. You cannot use his project as leverage in a marital dispute. Then tell your brother to stop stapling his solvency to my signature. There it was again, that line she could never cross honestly, the difference between marriage and infrastructure. She had wanted them blurred while it benefited her and distinct the second the consequences turned. You're proving my point, she said. Everything with you becomes a mechanism. No. Everything around you became casual because you assumed I wouldn't check the machinery. A longer silence this time. Then, softly, dangerously, did you have someone going through my private communications? If there are communications relevant to misuse of internal access or related party exposure, they'll be reviewed. That means yes. That means you're asking the wrong question. She inhaled sharply. For a moment I thought she might cry. Instead she said, you always needed to be the more serious person in the room. Even now. I could have answered the marriage. The loneliness. The way she had stopped touching me months before she stopped pretending publicly. I could have told her what it felt like to fund someone's reinvention and then be recast in their story as an obstacle to their becoming. But some truths lose dignity when delivered to the person currently weaponizing them. So I said, Blake will reach out tonight. If you need anything immediate, it goes through counsel. Adrian. I hung up. 10 minutes later Mara joined me in the park wearing a navy coat, gloves, and the expression of a woman arriving not to comfort but to secure perimeter. She handed me a coffee and a thin folder. Household changes are live, she said. Cards remain active until 7 a.m. for optics unless you say otherwise. Drivers removed. Staff notified that any instructions affecting records, storage, or personal office materials require dual authorization. Harbor line frozen pending review. Charles has called my office 3 times. Did you answer? Not personally. My deputy told him governance matters don't move by outrage. I laughed, first time sincerely all night. Marry her, Mara said, meaning herself in the third person the way she did when trying to stop me from thanking her. She sat across from me and opened the folder. The forensic team had accelerated review after the dinner. Enough to send a preliminary memo. Nothing explosive yet. But there were patterns now impossible to ignore. Helena accessing donor strategy decks she had no operational reason to open, a shared note export involving Riverside's apprenticeship endowment language, Julian's firm receiving a draft communications plan with internal governance references embedded in metadata, and one document tag associated with Harbor's debt rollover timeline. It's circumstantial, Mara said. But it's converging. Do you think Charles knew? Knew exactly? Probably not. Knew enough to feel optimistic tonight? Yes. I nodded. Some men are too disciplined to ask for specific corruption. They simply create atmospheres in which useful impropriety feels normal. Mara studied me for a second. Do you want the truth or the gentle version? Truth. Tonight wasn't only a divorce play. It was a control play. Serve publicly, establish emotional frame, extract concessions under the banner of dignity, keep Harbor alive, keep Helena centered at Riverside, and push settlement discussions before you evaluate full exposure. They assumed you would try to preserve appearances. I did preserve appearances. No, Mara said. You preserved structure. Much rarer. At 11:40 that night I checked into the Lowell under an alias my office kept for ugly situations. Not because I feared Helena. Because shared houses become crime scenes of interpretation after marriages end. Every drawer opened becomes a story. Every missing watch becomes an accusation. I was too old and too solvent to let heartbreak drag me into amateur theater. I showered, sat on the edge of the bed in a hotel robe, and finally let myself feel it. Not the anger. That was easy. The grief. It arrived not as devastation but as inventory. Her book on the bedside table at home. The Florence earrings she'd worn to serve me. The time she'd fallen asleep on my shoulder on a train from Providence. The messages from years earlier when law school admissions had come in and she'd cried in my office because she was terrified she'd fail publicly. The version of her I had loved had not been wholly imaginary. That's what makes betrayal expensive. It taxes memory too. I slept badly. At 6:12 a.m. I woke to a text from Elise. Harbor lenders requesting emergency call. Seems Preston represented extension as secured. At 6:20 Mara sent another. Riverside emergency board packet prepared. Helena contesting removal. Suggest no direct engagement. At 6:47 Blake forwarded a message from Helena's attorneys. They proposed an immediate standstill on operational changes and requested mutual respect for ongoing lifestyle expectations pending amicable settlement. I read that twice. Lifestyle expectations. There's a phrase only people cushioned by other people's labor can write without embarrassment. By 8:30 I was in a conference room with Blake, Mara, and Elise on video. We built a timeline. Locked document retention. Identified potential exposure. The rule was simple: no vindictiveness, no sloppiness, no improvisation. At 9:15 Blake received the first truly panicked call of the day. From Charles. Charles wanted to speak man-to-man. Blake told him there was no such category anymore. At 10:40 Riverside convened emergency board session without Helena. She joined through counsel and argued exclusion based on marital retaliation. Mara responded by laying out access irregularities, conflict concerns, and fiduciary necessity. The board voted 7-1 to suspend her pending review. Evelyn called me immediately afterward. I shouldn't have answered. But I did, because some part of me still wanted to hear whether she understood anything at all. Adrian, she said, voice breaking on the first syllable, this has gone far enough. It started far enough, I said. Helena is devastated. I looked out the conference room window at Lower Manhattan shining in hard morning light and thought of the envelope sliding across linen. Thought of 40 witnesses and a candle burning while she called humiliation honesty. That's not a moral argument, I said. That's a weather report. Evelyn drew a breath like someone trying to swallow a bruise. Whatever has happened between you two, Preston should not be punished. Preston shouldn't have built his financing model around my unspoken obedience. He has employees. Contractors. Families depending on him. Then he should have learned to run a business before building one in a marina town for Instagram couples. That was cruel. True, but cruel. She started crying then, quietly. Not dramatic. Which made it harder. I know we have not always made things easy, she said. But Helena did love you once. Once. Past tense arriving from her mother like a notarized document. I know, I said. That was the end of the call. At noon the other shoe dropped. Julian March's firm, apparently believing silence might save fees if not dignity, informed Helena's attorneys they were withdrawing from all Riverside-related work pending independent review of information provenance. I heard this from Mara first. Then from Blake. Then indirectly from a journalist who texted my office asking whether donor governance concerns were affecting the foundation. When a scandal becomes expensive, consultants are usually the first rats off the chandelier. Helena texted me at 12:17. Did you leak this? I replied once. No. I organized it. She didn't answer. That evening, a little after 7, Charles showed up at my office unannounced. Not the reception desk. My actual office. Which meant someone in the lobby still mistook his surname for authorization. He stood by the window in a charcoal coat, hands behind his back, looking out over the river as if he already owned the view. When I entered, he turned with the exhausted righteousness of a man finally forced to negotiate with someone he'd spent years classifying as temporary. I came alone, he said. That's good, I said. Crowds have been bad for us lately. He ignored that. Name your number. There is something almost beautiful about the speed with which certain men reveal themselves once prestige stops working. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just valuation. For what? I asked. To keep Harbor moving, contain Riverside, and settle this without destroying Helena publicly. I sat behind my desk. You think this is about a number? Everything is about a number eventually. That's why you never understood me, I said. You think utility means price. He stepped closer. Don't moralize. You have enjoyed being useful to this family when it made you feel superior. No, I said. I enjoyed believing loyalty was reciprocal. Helena made a personal choice. You're turning it into institutional bloodsport. She turned it institutional when she served me with witnesses while internal files were circulating where they shouldn't. His jaw tightened. You can't prove what you're implying. Maybe not all of it. Yet. But I don't need to prove adultery to prove bad governance. That's the part you misread. You built your whole strategy around scandal. I built mine around documentation. That sentence hit him harder than anything else I said. Because it was true. He looked suddenly older. Not smaller. Men like Charles don't shrink. They ossify. What do you want? He asked again, and this time it sounded less like negotiation than fatigue. I thought about Helena. About the woman at the museum. About the one in my kitchen years later asking corporate questions in a marriage voice. About the envelope. About the fact that for all their sophistication, the Carringtons still believed power meant deciding when someone else should be grateful. I want exactly what your daughter demanded, I said. Clarity. She leaves with what is hers under the agreements she signed. Not $1 less. Not $1 more. Harbor stands on its own paper. Riverside stays clean. And if anyone in your family ever again implies I retaliated because I was abandoned, I will release every timeline, every access log, and every witness statement we have. He held my gaze for a long second. Then he nodded once, a movement so reluctant it was almost educational. You always were more dangerous than Helena said. No, I said. You were always more comfortable underestimating me than updating the story. He left without shaking my hand. By Monday morning Harbor was in technical default, Riverside had announced independent governance review, Julian's name had vanished from Helena's public materials, and the papers she had handed me on my birthday no longer looked like an elegant exit. They looked like what they had really been from the beginning. A match struck too close to the wrong structure. I saw Helena in person again 9 days after my birthday. Not at home. Not at court. At Blake's office. On neutral furniture chosen by people who understand that divorce is partly about reducing the number of objects later described in affidavits. She wore gray. No earrings. No performance makeup. The first thing I noticed was that she looked tired in a way expensive skincare cannot negotiate with. The second was that Julian wasn't there. Good. Blake sat beside me. Her counsel sat beside her. A legal assistant took notes no one would admit mattered emotionally, even though those notes would become the weather system of our next 6 months. Helena opened with practicalities. Residence schedule. Personal effects. Media silence. The dog, which had technically been hers before the marriage but loved whoever fed him and therefore belonged morally to confusion. I answered where necessary. Deferred where prudent. Let Blake carry the mechanical weight. Then, about 40 minutes in, Helena asked for 5 minutes alone with me. Blake looked at me. Mara's warnings moved through my head like a second spine. Door open, I said. Visible line of sight. 5 minutes. Everyone pretended that was normal. It wasn't. But then nothing about us was normal anymore. When the room cleared to the threshold, Helena sat across from me and folded her hands the same way she had at the birthday dinner, only this time there was no audience to reward the posture. You really had all of it set up, she said. No, I said. I had protections. Those aren't the same thing. She looked down at the table. Preston says you've ruined him. Preston ruined himself. I just stopped buffering the consequences. A slow breath. You always make it sound so simple. Only after it's already been made complicated on purpose. For a moment she said nothing. Then, Julian is gone. I didn't answer. I thought you should know, she said. Why? Because you're probably imagining some great romance. There wasn't one. That almost made me angry again. Not because I wanted there to be romance. Because of the arrogance buried inside the statement. As if the real injury would have been passion, and not the smaller, cheaper insult of convenience. That doesn't help your case, I said. Her mouth tightened. I'm not making a case. You've been making one for months. Fine, she said. Then here's the part no one in your orbit ever understands. Living with you was like living inside a beautifully managed system. Nothing ever broke. Nothing was ever late. Nothing was ever uncertain once you touched it. But after a while it stopped feeling like love and started feeling like infrastructure. I couldn't tell whether you were with me because you adored me or because you don't know how to let a thing under your care fail. There it was. Not innocence. Not even full accountability. But something closer to truth than what she'd offered at dinner. I considered it seriously because that was one promise I had made to myself: if the truth appeared, even from damaged hands, I would still look at it. You might have been right about some of that, I said. I did turn care into function. I know that. But you don't get to use my limitations to excuse your methods. She nodded once, eyes wet but not spilling. I know. Do you? More now than I did then. I leaned back. Why the birthday? Her answer came fast enough to be real. Because if I'd done it privately, you would have stayed calm, called lawyers, and by morning every piece on the board would already be in motion. I wanted one moment where I wasn't the smaller force. That hit harder than the affair. Because it was honest in a way the papers had not been. She had wanted power, not just exit. She had wanted the spectacle because spectacle was the only arena in which she believed she could make me feel off balance. So you humiliated me to feel proportionate, I said. She closed her eyes briefly. When you say it like that. How else is there to say it? No answer. The hallway noises outside the room seemed suddenly louder. Someone laughed near the elevators. A printer spat out pages. Somewhere a marriage not ours was probably being started, ended, or invoiced. Helena opened her eyes again. I did love you, she said. I need you to know that wasn't fake. I know it wasn't fake, I said. That's what makes it tragic instead of just disgusting. That finally broke something in her expression. Not dramatically. Just enough. Adrian, are you ever going to forgive me? This is where movies lie to people. They make forgiveness sound like a clean noun waiting in a drawer until somebody asks for it sincerely enough. Real forgiveness is administrative. It changes access slowly. It reclassifies memory. It decides whether the damage remains active in the body. Eventually, I said. Probably. But not in a way that gives you back authority over what happened. Tears spilled then, quick and silent. Helena wiped them away immediately, almost angrily. You know what the worst part is? She asked. No. I really thought I understood where all the power was. I looked at her for a long time before answering. So did your family. The 5 minutes ended. By the time formal negotiations began again, the temperature between us had changed. Not softened. Clarified. Divorce, when done without television levels of insanity, is mostly the management of disillusionment. We divided property according to structures already in place. She kept what was contractually hers, including personal accounts, her independent investments, and the upstate cottage her grandmother had settled on her years before she met me. The brownstone remained mine. The Lake Street apartment was never hers to request. Her counsel pushed. Blake declined. Numbers moved. Expectations narrowed. Reality, once invited in, is a ruthless mediator. Preston tried 3 separate times through intermediaries to reopen harbor. I refused every path that required my name. Charles never called me directly again. Evelyn sent one handwritten note on cream stationery that said simply, I am sorry for my part in this. That sentence mattered more than the pages around it. Riverside completed review in 6 weeks. Helena resigned permanently before they could vote on censure. Julian's firm settled a document handling dispute without admitting wrongdoing, which is legal language for "we would like the fire to stop spreading." The press never got the full story because I refused to feed it. That disappointed a lot of people who confused justice with spectatorship. I moved back into the brownstone after Blake cleared the inventory process. For the first 2 weeks the place sounded wrong. A shared house after separation is full of acoustic ghosts. The stair that usually creaks at 7 p.m. because someone else is coming down. The cabinet left open. The absence of a second toothbrush somehow louder than an argument. I almost sold the place. Didn't. Instead I repainted the library, tore out the dining room drapes Helena had chosen because they looked continental, and invited my mother to stay for a week. She came with 2 suitcases, a casserole dish, and the blunt tenderness of women who have survived things without branding the survival. On the second night she stood in the kitchen drying plates and said, "Your father would have hated the way they did it." I know. He'd also tell you not to become proud of being right. I looked at her. Am I? She shrugged. A little. Understandably. But don't build your next life out of correctives. My mother had a genius for sentences that take months to finish arriving. So I listened. I cut back on travel for 1 quarter. Promoted 2 younger operators who'd been carrying more than I admitted. Expanded Riverside's apprenticeship track into Ohio in my father's name. Started sleeping like a man who no longer expects the person beside him to be quietly measuring exit routes. There is no cinematic moment when pain ends. There are mornings. Coffee that tastes normal again. A song you forgot was shared becoming just a song. A Sunday afternoon in which nobody asks where a document is, who texted after midnight, or whether affection is being leveraged into obligation. That's recovery. Not fireworks. Better. By spring, people stopped asking careful questions and returned to the ordinary selfishness of their own lives. Which is healthy, if rude. I turned 41 at a job site in Newark with paper plates, bad sheet cake, and 12 field supervisors arguing about baseball. Someone put a traffic cone on my chair. Somebody else brought bourbon in a coffee thermos. At the end of the day one of the apprentices asked whether the rumor was true that I had once signed divorce papers at my own birthday dinner and then shut down $100 million family illusion before dessert. I looked at him and said, "Parts of that are dramatized." He grinned. So that's a yes. Maybe it was. Maybe all the best stories are just facts that survived humiliation long enough to develop posture. But if you think the story ends with her ruined and me victorious, you've missed the only part that still matters to me. I didn't win because Helena lost. I won because when the moment came, I did not abandon myself just to preserve the feelings of people already prepared to erase me. That distinction saved me. And 6 months after the divorce was finalized, it was the same distinction I carried with me into the last time I ever saw Helena Carrington Quinn socially. It happened in Boston at the Commonwealth Club during a utilities philanthropy dinner I had almost skipped. Riverside had partnered with a vocational consortium to fund apprenticeships in water systems, public transit maintenance, and emergency grid restoration. The kind of work donors call transformative once it becomes photogenic enough for annual reports. I was there because the program mattered and because one board member had twisted my arm by reminding me that if I wanted skilled labor to stop being treated like a backup plan, I had to keep showing up in rooms that preferred polished abstractions to dirty competence. The ballroom was all white tablecloths and chandeliers pretending electricity was elegant instead of infrastructural. I had just finished speaking with a union training director from Fall River when I saw Helena across the room. She was standing beside Evelyn. For a second memory moved faster than time. My body recognized the line of her shoulders before my mind registered the rest. Then the details settled. Different haircut. Simpler dress. No Carrington brightness around her, just a contained stillness I had not seen before. She looked older, which was natural. So did I. But she also looked more literal somehow, as if life had sanded off a layer of curation and left a real woman standing there without as much lighting. Evelyn saw me first. Her face changed in a way I still haven't fully named. Shame, yes. But also relief. The peculiar relief of a person who has lived too long inside posture and finds that a reckoning, once survived, is less exhausting than maintaining the old fiction. She touched Helena's arm and said something. Helena turned. We looked at each other across 40 feet of donor money and glassware. Then she walked over. Not quickly. Not theatrically. Just directly. Hello, Adrian, she said. Helena. Up close, I noticed she was nervous. There was a new habit in her hands, a slight tightening at the knuckles when she spoke. It made her seem younger and older at once. I heard your speech, she said. It was good. Thank you. The apprenticeship program in Toledo. I read about it. Your father would have been proud. That one nearly undid me. Not because of her. Because my father had been dead 3 years and pride still felt like a language I wanted translated properly. I nodded. I hope so. There was a pause. Not painful. Just honest. Helena glanced toward Evelyn, who had tactfully disappeared into conversation with someone else. Can I say something without you assuming it's strategy? I considered that. You can say it. I reserve judgment on motive. One corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. More recognition. Fair, she said. She folded her hands, then let them go again. I was cruel. Not just selfish. Not just dishonest. Cruel. I've spent a lot of time trying to phrase it in ways that make me look complicated instead of small, and I think that's part of the problem. I wanted out, yes. I felt suffocated, yes. Some of my complaints were real. But the way I did it was about ego. And fear. And wanting one moment where I got to feel like the person with the blade. I listened without rescuing her from the discomfort. That was new for me too. She went on. For months after everything happened, I told myself you had overreacted because that was easier than admitting I had detonated my own life trying to control the framing of its ending. But you didn't overreact. You responded. Thoroughly. That's one word for it. She nodded. I deserved worse than the dignity you actually gave me. Maybe. Maybe not. Vengeance is seductive mostly because it offers clean arithmetic for pain. But pain does not balance. It mutates. It spills. You either build channels for it or you let it flood innocent parts of your own life. I had learned that much by then. I'm not interested in worse, I said. I was interested in done. Her eyes lifted to mine. Are you? Done, I mean. Another lie people tell is that closure arrives like a stamp. Approved. Final. Sealed. In reality it is more like noticing an old injury no longer alters your gait. Yes, I said after a moment. I think I am. She swallowed. Good. Then, because life has a vicious little sense of symmetry, she smiled faintly and said, Happy belated birthday, I guess. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Not because the memory was funny. Because enough time had passed that the absurdity was finally allowed into the room. That was a terrible gift, I said. Historically bad, she agreed. We stood there for a second in the wreckage made ordinary by time. Then she surprised me. Julian proposed to someone else last month, she said. I raised an eyebrow. That feels like information I do not need. No, she said. You don't. I think some part of me wanted you to know there was no grand alternate life waiting behind all that. No beautiful second act. Just consequences and a lot of therapy. That was the closest thing to humility I'd ever heard from her. "Therapy's good," I said. Annoyingly so. I almost smiled again. She looked around the ballroom, then back at me. "You're different," she said. "So are you. I don't mean calmer. You were always calm when it counted. I mean, lighter." I thought about that. The field cruise. My mother's casserole dish in the kitchen. The apprenticeship expansion. The nights of unbroken sleep. The fact that I no longer spent energy translating myself into a dialect of acceptability for people determined to hear lack in any accent but their own. "Maybe," I said. "Turns out peace has better posture than proving a point." She let that sit between us. Then she said the only thing that really mattered. "I'm sorry, Adrian. For the dinner. For the papers. For the humiliation. For making your love sound like a weakness to justify what I wanted to do." This time I didn't analyze the phrasing. I just received it. Not as repair. Repair was impossible. As accuracy. "Thank you," I said. She nodded once, as if that were more grace than she'd expected. It probably was. Then she stepped back. "Take care of yourself. You too." And that was it. No dramatic music. No collapse. No secret desire to start over. Just two people who had once built a life badly, standing in a ballroom full of polished philanthropy, finally speaking in plain language. After she walked away, I stayed for one more panel, shook a few hands, and slipped out before dessert. Outside, Boston was cold and bright with that harbor wind that makes every building feel slightly temporary. I stood on the steps for a minute watching headlights move through the dark and thought about how close I had once come to confusing endurance with self-respect. That confusion costs people decades. If you're listening to this and you've ever had someone hand you a version of yourself you were supposed to accept because keeping the peace looked nobler than telling the truth, hear me carefully. You do not owe anyone your helplessness. You do not owe anyone a breakdown to prove they hurt you. And you definitely do not owe lifelong access to the life you built just because somebody learned how to stand close to it. Sign what needs to be signed. Call who needs to be called. Protect what is yours without becoming monstrous about it. That last part matters. Anyone can destroy. It takes character to draw a boundary so cleanly that even the people who crossed it are forced, eventually, to admit where the line really was. On my 40th birthday. My wife handed me divorce papers in front of 40 witnesses and expected a man in shock. What she got was a man in focus. And if there's any lesson worth keeping from that night, it's this. Love without respect becomes charity. Charity without honesty becomes resentment. And resentment, when dressed up as courage, will always eventually expose itself. As for me, I kept the signed copy of those papers for exactly 1 year in a locked file with the harbor default notice, Riverside suspension memo, and a photograph from my 41st birthday at the Newark job site. Then I shredded everything except the picture. Not because the documents stopped mattering. Because they had finished doing their job. The picture is still in my office. Paper plates. Orange cones in the background. Bad cake. 12 exhausted men grinning like idiots. Me in a reflective vest with bourbon in a coffee cup and no one at that table wondering whether I belonged there. That's the image I kept. Not the candle. Not the envelope. Not the room where elegance tried to disguise cruelty and failed. Just the evidence that after all of it, I was still standing in a life that was fully mine. And these days, that's more than enough. If this story hit you anywhere personal, you already know why. And if you've ever watched someone mistake your restraint for weakness, take that as your reminder that silence is only surrender when you hand over structure with it. I didn't. That's why the phone call mattered. Not because it ruined her. Because it saved me.